It was a dark Friday over Jerusalem. Clouds gathered above Golgotha, anticipating the moment that would divide history forever. At the foot of 3 crosses, a Roman centurion followed his orders, another crucifixion. This time, it was Jesus of Nazareth. His duty was clear: ensure that Jesus died. And he carried it out. When the 6th hour arrived, darkness enveloped the land until the 9th hour. Then at that moment, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Shortly after, he gave a loud cry and breathed his final breath. Suddenly, the temple veil split from top to bottom, and the centurion, standing before him, declared, "Truly this man was the Son of God." That day, the Roman soldier's life was forever changed. The very man assigned to oversee Jesus' execution was shaken to his core. He went from executioner to eyewitness, from piercing the body of Jesus with a spear to becoming the first Gentile to believe he was the Son of God. He gave up his high rank in the world's greatest empire and followed Christ. He traveled to distant lands, spreading the gospel with the fervor of someone who had seen it all and had been transformed by it. His end, though tragic, entered church history under a name we remember today: Longinus. Before that fateful Friday, Longinus had served as a Roman centurion, commanders of legions, each leading over 100 soldiers. These men were admired for their discipline, bravery, and battlefield prowess. Longinus had built his life around violence, discipline, and blind obedience. To become a centurion required more than strength. It demanded intelligence, strategy, and above all, ruthlessness. Longinus embodied all of that. His world was order, bloodshed, and loyalty to Rome. He had faced death without flinching and executed commands without pause. He had become a weapon of the empire until that day. The city was still waking up when hurried footsteps echoed and whispers spread through the alleys. Whispers of a name: Jesus of Nazareth. The night before, Jesus had been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, betrayed by one of his own, Judas Iscariot, who had sold him out for 30 silver coins. He was brought before the Sanhedrin, the high council of priests, accused of blasphemy for calling himself the Son of God. They beat him, spat on him, and condemned him, but lacked the power to execute. For that, they needed Rome. At dawn, they dragged him to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. Seated on the judgment seat, Pilate looked curiously at Jesus and asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus calmly replied, "You have said so." Though the priests hurled endless accusations, Jesus remained silent. Pilate leaned in and asked, "Don't you hear their charges? Aren't you going to speak?" Yet Jesus said nothing, not a word in defense. Pilate was stunned. He had seen countless men beg and plead for mercy, but this one radiated an unshakable calm. Then a messenger approached Pilate with urgency. It was a warning from his wife. "Have nothing to do with this righteous man, for I've suffered greatly in a dream because of him." Pilate grew uneasy. He sensed something far bigger was at play, something beyond his control. During Passover, it was customary to release a prisoner. Pilate offered the crowd a choice: Jesus or Barabbas, a known murderer. The priests had already swayed the crowd. "Release Barabbas," they roared. "And what should I do with Jesus?" Pilate asked. The crowd responded with fury, "Crucify him." Still uneasy, Pilate questioned, "Why? What evil has he done?" But the crowd only screamed louder, "Crucify him." Seeing he was losing control, Pilate washed his hands before them and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility." Then he released Barabbas and handed Jesus over to be crucified. Jesus was led into the praetorium. Longinus, the centurion, stood watch as always. He had overseen many punishments. He had watched men break and die. But this prisoner was different. He didn't resist. He didn't scream or beg. He took each blow as if he understood why it had to happen. The soldiers mocked him. They stripped him, tied him to a pillar, and whipped him mercilessly. The lash tore his flesh again and again, yet he didn't cry out. Longinus stood, arms folded, his face hardened by years of war. But something in his eyes began to change. The soldiers mocked him further, wrapping him in a purple robe, driving a crown of thorns onto his head. Blood poured down his face. His eyes, however, remained steady. They gave him a stick, pretending it was a scepter, and laughed. "Hail, King of the Jews!" Longinus didn't join their cruelty. He just watched, and for the first time in years he felt disturbed, not by the brutality, but by the dignity of the man enduring it. They spat on him, struck him. When they tired of mocking him, they removed the robe and dressed him again. They prepared him for crucifixion. But Longinus couldn't look away. Something in him had begun to awaken. He didn't understand why this man didn't defend himself. Why, in the midst of pain, his face showed compassion, not hate. As they shoved the cross onto Jesus' back, Longinus led the way. They pushed through the crowd toward Golgotha, the place of skulls, where Rome discarded those it wished to erase. People yelled, spat, and cursed. Others wept. Mary, his mother, searched through the crowd, eyes desperate. Jesus collapsed beneath the weight of the cross. Soldiers yelled for him to rise. He did slowly, then fell again. Mary reached him and whispered, "I'm here." Jesus raised his bloodied face and softly said, "You see, Mother, I make all things new." A third time he collapsed. Longinus grabbed a passerby, Simon, and commanded, "Help him carry the cross." Jesus looked at Simon with quiet gratitude. As they marched on, he turned to the weeping women and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but for yourselves and your children." Longinus heard the words. They struck something deep within. At Golgotha, the soldiers nailed Jesus to the cross. He didn't resist. He stretched his arms willingly. A hammer fell. A cry rose. Mary trembled. John turned away. Some wept. Others mocked. Longinus stood still. 3 men hung. Jesus in the center. Criminals on either side. The posts were raised with force, and Jesus' body shook from the impact. One criminal mocked him. "Aren't you the Christ? Save us." The other rebuked him and turned to Jesus. "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replied, "Truly, today you will be with me in paradise." Longinus, hearing this, was stunned. Never had he seen such peace. Darkness fell over the land. Jesus, hanging there, spoke, not curses but forgiveness. "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." A chill ran through Longinus's chest. As Jesus' strength faded, he looked upon his mother and said, "Woman, behold your son." To John, "Behold your mother." Then came his final cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A bystander raised a vinegar-soaked sponge, but Jesus refused. He looked toward the sky and said, "It is finished." Then, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." He died, and the earth responded. The ground trembled. Rocks split. The temple veil tore. Silence. Then terror. Longinus fell to his knees and whispered words that had waited within him. Truly this man was the Son of God. What followed changed everything. The centurion who had once commanded the crucifixion became the first Gentile to publicly proclaim the divinity of the crucified Christ. And then silence wrapped Golgotha like a veil. Jesus' lifeless body hung on the cross. Sensing the growing unrest, the soldiers began to withdraw. The crowd, now uneasy and shaken, started to scatter. It was preparation day for Passover, and according to Jewish custom, no bodies were to remain on crosses during the Sabbath. The religious leaders approached Pilate, requesting the legs of the condemned be broken to hasten their deaths. The order was passed to Longinus, who gave the command without hesitation. The soldiers took a heavy iron bar, approached the criminals beside Jesus, and broke their legs. Longinus, knowing Jesus was already dead, still had to confirm it. It was Roman protocol. He stepped forward, gripped his spear, and with one powerful motion pierced Jesus' side. And from that wound, blood and water flowed out. The evangelist John, who stood nearby, would later write solemnly, "And he who saw it bore witness, and his testimony is true." Longinus looked down at his spear, now stained with sacred blood. He glanced again at the wound, and unknowingly, he had just witnessed the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. They will look upon him whom they have pierced. The blood symbolized redemption. The water, purification. That sacred mixture spilled onto Longinus's face. Tradition says he had long suffered from a condition that impaired his vision. But the moment the blood touched his eyes, his sight returned. He could see clearly again. Right there at the foot of the cross, beneath a darkened sky, Longinus wept and finally understood. He realized he had not pierced the body of a criminal, but of the Son of God. He fell again to his knees, not as a soldier, but now as a believer. Though Scripture does not recount every detail that followed, ancient writings and church tradition preserve what came next. Longinus, shaken to the core by what he had seen, could not simply return to his old life. Sleep evaded him for nights. The image of Jesus, bleeding, silent, compassionate, haunted him with sacred weight. He could no longer obey orders as he once did, blindly serving a vast empire. After the crucifixion, rumors filled Jerusalem. Whispers that Jesus' tomb had been found empty. Talk of visions, of encounters with the very man he had watched die. Longinus said nothing, but each word reached deep into his soul, igniting a flame he could not put out. He knew, deep down, none of it was a lie. Death had not been the end. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Golgotha, heard Jesus' voice, remembered every word, every glance. The world returned to its rhythm, but Longinus could not. The ruthless centurion he had been began to vanish. His iron-forged heart cracked. When he heard people say Jesus had risen, he wasn't shocked. He felt no doubt, no confusion, only certainty. Yes, it was true. Jesus had conquered death. For the first time, Longinus began to understand what faith truly meant. He grasped the weight of the cross, the miracle of forgiveness, the unstoppable force of redemption. He left the army, turned in his sword, laid down his armor. Without a word, he walked away from Rome and into a life of faith. He sought out the disciples, found those who had known Jesus, and began learning from the very followers of the man he had once crucified. His name began to circulate among the early believers. Longinus, the Roman centurion, once a commander in the name of the empire, now walked barefoot through the streets, heart ablaze with a message of hope. He preached of a king whose crown had been made of thorns, a king he had helped crucify. For years, he traveled through the lands of Cappadocia and Caesarea, modern-day Turkey, telling his story, proclaiming the gospel with unmatched fervor. I saw him die, he would say, and in his death I found life. People believed him, not because he was eloquent, but because he had been there, because his testimony was truth. He wasn't a preacher repeating tales. He was a witness whose story moved hearts. The hand that once held a spear now raised the gospel. But Rome never forgave betrayal, especially from one of its own. And soon, persecution came. Longinus was arrested, interrogated, beaten, threatened. They offered him freedom, if only he would deny Christ. But he did not waver. He stood firm with the peace of a man who had found the truth. So they condemned him. The same empire that had made him a soldier now called him a traitor. They led him outside the city walls, and on a lonely hill they beheaded him. Longinus died a martyr, not in terror, but with his gaze lifted heavenward, mirroring the man he once saw raise his eyes and say, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." His body was buried in Cappadocia. There, local believers began to venerate his memory. They said miracles happened at his tomb. Healing was found where his body lay, and his name lived on, not as an executioner, but as a witness, a believer, a martyr. Through centuries, the church remembered him as Saint Longinus, the one who saw, the one who believed, the one who gave his life for the one who gave his life first. Yet Longinus was not alone. You must hear of Peter, of John, of James, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, Simon, Thaddeus, and the other James. From the streets of Jerusalem to the far corners of the earth, these 12 men carried a message powerful enough to shake kings, dismantle empires, and divide time itself. They had no armies, no weapons, no alliances. All they carried was their faith and the unshakable truth of what they had seen. Now, you must watch the story unfold. The video on your screen is the movie Apostles. This isn't just the history of the church. It is the legacy of 12 men who stood against the might of Rome and conquered the world, not with violence, but with faith and with the sacrifices they made.